Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Parthemore, and I'm the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risks. CSR is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to analyzing and addressing core systemic risks to security in the 21st century. Thank you so much for everybody for joining today's discussion. The central focus of our work at CSR is seeking to improve capabilities for addressing biological threats of all origins and promoting steps to help prevent catastrophic effects like we've been witnessing with the COVID-19 pandemic from ever happening again. A critical aspect of this work is determining how best to place investments, of which there are potentially billions of dollars on the table from the US government perspective for the coming years to get us the tools that we need. And this spans technologies for early warning and forecasting of diseases, for diagnostic tools that can be used in settings ranging from people's homes to high-tech laboratories, for rapidly developing vaccines and other medical treatments, and much more. Moreover, for preventing catastrophic biological threats, it's best to that these elements combine into a functional system where they all work and are applied in concert. We're at a real inflection point in this regard, given that many of the technologies that we need are available today. Some are progressing in relatively early stages of development, others are later stage and just need some testing and tweaking before they're ready, and still others are ready and in use today. Cutting edge technologies that could be game changing in preventing future pandemics and reducing catastrophic biological risks. Put together, these tools could save millions of lives. And this is the topic of today's webinar, which we'll also post to CSR's YouTube channel to be available in the future. Toward the end of the discussion, we will take questions from participants. For now, I'm going to hand it over to Senior Fellow at CSR, Andy Weber, who is also formerly an Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs, to introduce our speakers and get the conversation rolling.
Thanks, Christine. Good morning, everybody. We have two great speakers today. First up will be Vik Bajaj, who is Managing Director of Foresight Capital, or Foresight Labs, a biotech company incubator. Dr. Bajaj previously served as Chief Scientific Officer at Grail, a startup focused on developing technology for early detection of cancer. He is also co-founder and former Chief Scientific Officer of Verily, formerly Google Life Sciences, and served as chair of its scientific advisory, served as chair of its scientific advisory board. Dr. Bajaj advised the Department of Defense through the Defense Science Board's Task Force on Biology. In addition, Dr. Bajaj has multiple roles in academia. He is currently an adjunct associate professor of radiology at Stanford University Medical School and was a former academic PI at University of California, Berkeley and the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Throughout his career, Dr. Bajaj and his collaborators have developed numerous biomedical technologies relevant to pandemic prevention and disease detection, including nanotechnology probes for the early detection and miniaturized analytical systems for point of care testing. Aspects of this work have been commercialized through startups. We are thrilled to have Dr. Bajaj here today to share his expertise in technology development and commercialization. Second will be Dr. Luciana, or as I call her, Lou Borio. She's a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in biodefense, emerging infectious diseases, and medical product development. She is currently a venture partner at Arch, a firm that provides early stage venture capital for technology firms in life sciences, physical sciences, and information technology. Previously, Dr. Borio served as the vice president at InQtel, where she worked on identifying and delivering innovative technology solutions for the United States intelligence community. From 2017 to 2019, she was director for medical and biodefense preparedness at the National Security Council, where she focused on responding to the Ebola epidemic, addressing the antimicrobial resistance crisis, and developing an executive order to modernize America's influenza vaccines. Prior to that, Dr. Borio served as acting chief scientist of the US Food and Drug Administration and as assistant commissioner for counterterrorism policy of the FDA. Dr. Borio is an adjunct assistant professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins University and practices medicine part-time. We are excited to have her here today to share her very valuable experiences. So let's start with you, Vik.
Great. Thank you, Andy, and good morning to Christine and other colleagues from the CSR. Thank you so much for arranging this discussion. I also want to thank my colleague, Dr. Damien Segoyan, who's a CSR fellow with you, and he leads much of our thinking at Foresight on these topics. And Lou, of course, it's a great honor to be in a dialogue with you as well. So let me start, Andy, by stating a few things that I hope are obvious. As you said, we've faced in the last 2 years a crisis of truly unprecedented scale. More than 5 million lives have been lost. This is equal in history only to periods of sustained warfare, at least in recent history, an analogy that I will return to. And in economic terms, the global economy has contracted by 3.5%, where otherwise it may have grown by about the same amount. So trillions have been lost over 2 years. And yet our initial response to the pandemic, even in a wealthy state like California, has been just marked by disorganization. And it's certainly not equal to the challenge. So the narrow thing that I want to discuss is really how we can prepare ourselves for the future, for the initial steps in detecting and taking initial actions to arrest a pandemic. So I would say, first of all, we have to assume for planning purposes that a new episode of zoonotic illness will occur every few years in our modern connected world, and a pandemic perhaps on a decadal timescale. And we must also assume, which was not the case, say, 5 years ago, that the threat of biological warfare, once relevant perhaps only in the context of large national programs, will also be material in that timescale. There are now credible threat vectors, and in fact, our synthetic biology toolkit supports gain-of-function research with increasingly complex genetic perturbations that are now assessed through simple-to-read phenotypes. That's not here today, but the sophistication of that apparatus will grow considerably over the next decade. So, faced with a problem that large, it's of course tempting to boil the ocean. Indeed, it touches upon all aspects of our supply chain and economy, not just the biomedical economy. But again, I want to focus on just a piece of that, specifically how we can organize ourselves to effectively detect and take the very first steps in arresting a pandemic. And from my perspective, which is incomplete, there's 4 areas really to discuss. One is the idea of detecting the threat and global surveillance. Second, how do we make sense of the data that results from that kind of surveillance effort? What is a playbook then that defines initial actions? And something that we are increasingly concerned with is what are sustainable business models that would support that in the years between these episodes, where the world's attention and certainly the intention of people like me in the venture community may be focused elsewhere. So I'll just give a few thoughts on those topics at first, which hopefully we can discuss. So first of all, detection. I mean, let's talk for a moment about the birthplace of epidemiology as a science. It's an example that I refer to often. So you'll recall in the 19th century, cholera ravaged the capitals of Europe. And in the middle of one such notorious outbreak in London, a physician named John Snow used careful epidemiological surveillance, what we now call contact tracing, to show that the outbreak was centered around a particular water pump in London. And this was, mind you, at a time when the germ theory of disease, the causative agent of disease, was not widely understood. So he recommended an intervention without a scientific basis, which was to remove the handle of the pump. And in doing so, he arrested the epidemic. And of course, it took decades for the natural conclusions about sanitation and cholera, things that you might draw from that example, to spread throughout Europe and be acted upon. So this should seem very familiar to us. In fact, we do much of the same thing today. We detect an outbreak when patients show up with symptoms. We then do very old school contact tracing to figure out the dynamics of the disease, how it's spreading and in what population. And whatever we learned from that, I mean, obviously it doesn't take decades to propagate, but what we learn at least takes months and in some cases years to propagate. So we have a lot in common with that example from more than 100 years ago. So to move to a more modern solution, our first step, I believe, should be in replacing this methodology with a detection and early warning system that forms, to borrow an analogy from the security community, a defense in depth. First, in terms of what you could call endpoint security, we have already developed and now must deploy tests that are so affordable, specific, actionable, and easy to use that individuals can use them to diagnose respiratory illnesses or suspicious illnesses at home or at work. Second, we need community testing, including accessible networks of point-of-care testing centers, but also we need in the community modern approaches based, for example, on NGS assays that are capable of identifying many, many pathogens and even unknown pathogens. Third, related to that capability, we must do here what is done now routinely in the United Kingdom, which is to reflex positive cases in the early stages of a pandemic to sequencing immediately so that we can accomplish molecular epidemiology, molecular contact tracing, but also come to understand some of the causal drivers of pathogenesis for unknown pathogens, even in known families. So then to build out this surveillance and defense networks, we also need critical intelligence in non-symptomatic populations. For example, surveillance of sentinel populations through non-symptomatic presentation, through sequencing assays that can identify unknown pathogens early would be very productive. To find those populations, we need only look at the current pandemic and see populations of, for example, healthcare workers, TSA security workers, and others who had very high infection rates early, and they would be great targets for this kind of surveillance. And finally, there are technological approaches that are emerging beyond this, which would allow us to surveil the emergence of these pathogens in larger communities. One, for example, is immunosurveillance, the idea that you can build up a history of what antigens your immune system has seen. There are also emerging approaches in metagenomic surveillance of broad populations through things that they discard, or specific surveillance of populations in which zoonotic illness is endemic. For example, people working with livestock in the right places. Of course, without international cooperation, we can only do a component of this. The second topic, once we've accomplished that kind of surveillance, is really to talk through how we can make sense of this. And a lot of this, we pride ourselves in the rapid diffusion of scientific information in the pandemic through not peer-reviewed scientific journals, but forums like the archive. The problem is the actors who consume this information are not just scientists like us. It's very diverse, all the way from individual consumers to businesses, to local and state agencies like schools that may not have a public health capability, to national government. So if we create this kind of sentinel surveillance network, its outputs must be fed into a data network that provides both authoritative, it has to have absolutely unimpeachable scientific and statistical rigor, but also real-time information. Governments have not been able to do this. Big tech is trying to do this, but frankly, there are reasons to worry that big technology companies should not be in the business of deploying very large public health programs of this kind. Consumers in this are also an important but largely ignored frontier. We really need approaches to give consumers confidence in the decisions they make as the economy has reopened, as restaurants have reopened, and that's not something that as a field we've tackled well. The third topic is, what do we do in response to this information? And I think others can speak much more authoritatively about the interventions that are successful. But just as in the example of snow removing the pump handle, once we do something, we actually need to be able to gather information to measure whether or not it's working. and a system that allows us to assess all of these widespread experiments of nature, if you will, all over the world, where governments and individuals are behaving in different ways, and learn from them in real time, is very critical. So we need to know that actions are being taken in response to information and recommendations, and also whether or not they're working. Now, again, this is the subject of a lot of effort in the government, but it seems that these days, even trivial aspects of that are really mired in interagency processes that are taking years to read out. So it's very important to develop that infrastructure, but also to make the infrastructure useful to those who are, acting on the information it produces. The final topic, which I think is most interesting and vexing, is what is the right business model to support some of these things? It's tempting. We always make an analogy to national defense. In national defense, we're also preparing for what are, hopefully decadal events. Hopefully we're not going to war with increasing frequency. But the difference is that the DoD is the largest customer for actors in the defense industry, whether it's Lockheed or Boeing or others, where in this case, the government is a very small player in biotech, where most of the innovation that we're talking about rests. And sure enough, you see that there are so few private sector business models that already companies, for example, that we've invested in, are pivoting away from COVID into other kinds of disease surveillance. And that is very worrisome. So I'm tempted to recount this story, which is possibly apocryphal, about the Soviet chemical weapons program. At one point, the Soviet leadership was so convinced that the United States was ignoring its obligations under treaties that limited or banned the development of biological weapons that they decided to act. And faced with this perceived large funding gap and program gap, they infiltrated US and European pharmaceutical companies and found compounds that were failing due to human toxicity in phase 1 trials or in preclinical trials. And those compound groups were worked up as potent chemical weapons, some of which are in the arsenal today. And that is a very creative and nefarious example, but the government must do something similar now to harness the productivity of the biotech sector. And that is going to come through really government funding and the exercise of government purchasing power, not just at the national level, but even at the state level. For example, in California, you see now some ballot measures devoted to this topic. But that purchasing power must be exercised in a way that creates demand when the world's attention is off these topics. And in order to meet that demand, new kinds of contractors will emerge, and this industry must be managed by the government as part of a national and international resource, much in the same way that we see in the defense industry. And I know that you won't maybe hear a Silicon Valley venture capitalist argue for that kind of government funding, but we really must remember that Silicon Valley itself is built on several decades of uninterrupted government funding, which supported its activities at a time when there was a compromised private sector business model. So those are the things that worry me. Andy, hopefully those are things that we can discuss today and over the next months.
Right, I think that's wonderful. I mean, what you described is a system to prevent pandemics. I also feel that such a system will deter bioattacks and the deliberate use, development and use of biological weapons. And I just want to underscore how important it is that the U.S. government, especially the federal government, take some ownership of this and reach out to the technology sector, biomedical sector, where so much innovation is happening, and support the system that you describe. Given the costs of this pandemic, it seems to be a small investment. We at CSR have been calling for 10 plus 10 over 10. So 10 billion a year for each of the two agencies, HHS and DoD, over a decade. So that would be a total of $200 billion. And we think we can make this the last pandemic, leverage technology, and also deter the deliberate use of bioweapons with this. So Lou, you have a lot of government experience. You ran the biodefense group at the White House, the National Security Council, but now you have a different perspective at Arch Capital, as well as CFR, not to be confused with CSR. So please, Lou, what would you like to tell us this morning about some of these developments, and especially from the perspective of venture capital and technology?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be with you and Christine and Vik, and talking about some of the, the things that we have worked on together for so many, many years. And I look back at those days where I look back and I remember those days with fondness back in the Obama administration, where there was a biodefense enterprise, where the principals in each organization really worked cooperatively and together, right, with defined roles and responsibilities, taking care of a piece. And we made so much progress in those years with respect to countermeasure development and approval and information sharing and diagnostics. And and I think somewhere along the line we lost our way. I think we still have not really reestablished this enterprise. I think there's a lot of confusion still, and no real leader has emerged, even in this administration, that is really responsible for the biodefense enterprise and nurturing it. So hopefully we can, gain our footing. A lot of people ask me, what surprised you most about this pandemic? And I think that, what surprised me most is that I never imagined that we'd be in a situation where the system would not be optimized, right? So we know that it was going to be hard no matter what, because these threats are formidable. But I imagined that we would find a way to leverage our resources, our capabilities, our technological, strength to be able to address them. And I never imagined that would be so hampered by societal polarization and misinformation. So I think that it's going to be really critical as we focus on technologies going forward, that we also don't forget that we need to be able to support these other non-technical components of the enterprise, which is, efforts to understand and counter misinformation, to also continue to look at our legal and regulatory apparatus. Where does it need to be modernized? And we also need to figure out about the healthcare system. I know it seems like I want to boil the ocean, but all this incredible progress and optimism about, for example, the Merck and the Gilead oral antiviral drugs against COVID. And you can see from the news media and headlines that everybody's putting so much hope on those drugs. The fact is that most Americans have no prospect of accessing those drugs in time for them to make a difference today, because testing is a challenge, and getting a provider to write them a prescription is a challenge in the time that it's required. Most Americans do not have a primary care provider they can call and say, by the way, even like, somebody goes to the drugstore, gets tested on their own, right? They don't have anybody to call and make the request. And we see this play with the monoclonal antibodies, a delay in getting monoclonals. And I don't anticipate that we have solved this issue. And to me, that is the work of government. That is the work that government has to be doing, and I don't think they are doing. So that's, there's a lot of the ancillary components to the enterprise that need to be addressed. Maybe they should not even be called ancillary, maybe the non-technological components. The second one is, this idea that we do need a government that has a lot of clarity about its role and responsibility, because the private sector has so much innovation, but it can't do this alone. And I like to say that, the private sector is where innovation resides, tremendous amount of energy, innovation, creativity. The chief technology officer for Incotel likes to say that we're in the business of optimism, because you're always imagining the future, a better future. But government has the resources, has authorities, it has the values to prioritize what's critical at first. And I need to see government doing more of that. And I think that, it's good to look at countries, for example, like South Korea, that was able to really establish a very nice synergy between its government and the private sector, especially with respect to diagnostic tests. But it takes, of course, ongoing preparedness and dialogue. but it also takes this clarity about who's going to do what in the emergency and what is, the different types of roles. And, we need to have somebody in charge, clearly define metrics and assign points of responsibility in government and authority. We can't just leave this to be the way it is right now, where we have no idea who's really running the enterprise. And then third, I think that we are in the middle of a biorevolution. I think it's no surprise to this audience, and one that has profound consequences for our national security, national power, national economy, and national health, and extends beyond biomedicine, right? It impacts planetary health, agriculture. And we have the lead in the world for this robust innovation system. And because we do have a system that integrates the private sector, government working together, and academia. But I worry about it. And I worry about it because first, spending. We know that federal spending on R&D fell from around 1.5% of GDP in the early 1960s to just around 0.6% today. We absolutely need to reverse this trend of spending on R&D. We're not doing enough to also develop, attract, and retain scientific talent, especially with STEM. I think that the anti-immigration sentiment that rose sharply in recent years has done little to protect RIP, even though it's crucial that we do so. But we can't do it at the expense of turning off important collaborations. We need to do more also to, create opportunities for scientific convergence, because we know that the future relies on those convergence. And Vik mentioned that Silicon Valley and all that. That's government is great at doing that, and we need to be able to establish a national S&T infrastructure that facilitates convergence of disciplines. I mentioned also that we need to focus on the ethical, legal, and societal implications of technologies and how we're going to manage biodefense. Find a way that we can adhere to our most cherished values. Privacy is really important to us, but we can't let that get in the way also of reaping our benefits from technology. Political leadership is critical. And lastly, I think we can't forget all the extra technology facets of the bioenterprise, as I mentioned earlier. So we have to focus on the public health system, the healthcare system, surveillance system, supply chains, clinical trial capabilities, so that we can test, these countermeasures in real time. All that has to be, so it's a lot. I don't think it's boiling the ocean. I think it's really doable, but we need to have, again, a leader, a vision, resources, and a plan to execute against it. I'll leave it at that.
That's great, thanks. And for the participants, if you could put your questions in the Q&A function, so we can ask those on your behalf.
Or in the chat. Thanks.
Or in the chat's fine too. I'm excited about some of the acceleration of technology that's happened, during the COVID tragedy of the last 2 years. And one of the secretaries of defense that I worked for used to say, the DoD doesn't build anything. DoD buys things from the private company. DoD doesn't build airplanes or tanks or vaccines. They get them from the private sector. So there seems to be a different culture at CDC, NIH. They tend to want to do things themselves, or if they reach out, it's more to the academic community. Do you think that culture needs to change, that they need to rely more on the private sector for things like real-time infectious disease surveillance? I mean, there are a couple of bright lights, a couple of recent examples, and I'm going to ask each of you to sort of name a technology that you're excited about in this space that will come online in the next few years and really revolutionize the way we do detection and disease surveillance. For example, recently CDC contracted with the company in the airports that does massages and Ginkgo Bioworks to do pooled testing of by consent of passengers coming in from India to SFO, JFK, and Newark. That's an extraordinary example of CDC actually turning to the private sector. Earlier in the spring and summer, HHS and CDC had a contract with the company out of MIT called BioBot to do wastewater surveillance. That contract expired, but this is another example, and I think they're really good examples that we need to build on of turning to the private sector. But I would ask each of you, is there one technology, Vik, you mentioned this ballot initiative for metagenomics in California that I'm very excited about. But is there one technology that you'd like to highlight that it's not available today, but will be coming online in the next couple of years that will be a game changer? Starting with Vik, please.
Well, there are several technologies that exist today that don't exist in this incarnation. So I wouldn't say that the advances will come from de novo, totally new technologies, but even developing NGS assays, which is relatively straightforward, that are cheap and would allow us to diagnose rapidly a wide variety of pathogens, including unknown ones, is something that is just starting. So that's one. And second, I think that the tools and technologies for point of care detection continue to advance and become cheaper and cheaper. So the progression that you'll see now is to go away from really machines to things which just use reagents to accomplish the specificity and sensitivity, whether those are CRISPR-based or other approaches, in very, very affordable form factors. So you'll see kind of lateral flow type assays or things that are as simple as that, but they have the specificity of a nucleic acid sequencing test. And so I think you'll see that technology in the individual, and then similar things on a population scale that will give us a lot more information from every test. And that's coming already on the horizon.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I look forward to the day that I can have our daughter Snowy, spit or breathe into a tube in our bathroom every morning, and I can know that she's going off to school healthy that day. Or if not, what is it that she has that's causing a respiratory ailment, for example? Lou, obviously there's a big regulatory piece that needs to move too. What technologies are you excited about?
My gosh, we could take the whole hour talking about this, because I think we're in an incredible period of time, right? Like, of course, the diagnostics and surveillance and data integration, but I think that, we're just in the beginning to see what mRNA and derivative technologies are going to do. We're going to see cell and gene therapies that are going to play a role in biomedicine, but also biodefense. I think better decision algorithms are coming along the way. I think we'll see more, rapid vaccine design, rapid drug design, more tailored manufacturing. Right now, it's a cumbersome process, which reminds me that, I love when, I don't, being sarcastic, that people think, the company should give this vaccine away because they were developed with government money. Well, the fact is, government can't do what they did. They simply can't. It requires both government money and the amazing, ingenuity, logistics, and network that these companies have, right? So we should move away from this type of silly talk. But I do think that we are just beginning to see an incredible inflection point of potential cures that will strengthen our biodefense enterprise, not because they're being developed for biodefense purposes, but because we'll be able to leverage those.
That's great. Christine, over to you.
Sure. So there's one question in the chat so far directed at Lou, but you can both answer. And that's in terms of the legal and regulatory issues, what are the aspects that are most in need of modernization to be able to leverage the tools that we have better? Yeah,
well, I'll just give one that I think is low-hanging fruit, right? So we have the DPA, the Defense Production Act, for BARDA leverage it very heavily with DoD to be able to control the supply chain for vaccines. Well, NIH was not able to control the supply chain for clinical trials. It was, it's funded academic institutions, and it was competing within those academic institutions with a bunch of small, uninformative, observational trials for little products that had no prospect of really changing the course of the pandemic. And here we are, the government coming together with a prioritized list of countermeasures to be tested, monoclonals, just to name a few, a suite of platform trials. And it was competing for patients in the same institutions that it was funding. And all they could do was send a letter asking the institutions to please consider prioritizing NIH research, NIH coordinated research during the pandemic. I think in a crisis, we should completely do this differently, right? And the UK was a good example where they really leveraged the whole system. I don't know if they had the authority to do so, but they did so. I think in the US, we need authorities, and we need a same type of, crisis authorities for the NIH to be able to do clinical trials more efficiently.
Just maybe to say a few words on that, I completely agree with what Louis said, but I don't think that additional NIH control over trials would have helped in the US. The recovery trial in the UK is a great example. It was investigator initiated, and they were able to enroll and test so many interventions and really falsify a lot of misinformation very quickly, whereas equivalent efforts in the US, they actually had larger funding, but were misdirected and couldn't get off the ground. And I think part of this is a problem with the infrastructure that we have in the US for clinical trials, which is resulting in many market failures in cases where outcomes trials are needed. Those are ranging from cardiovascular disease, huge killer, to oncology, where we're doing a lot of screening trials in the UK rather than the US, to infectious disease now. And I just think that no amount of government incentives will fix that until we have a system that actually allows for real world evidence-based trials more effectively.
I don't think I disagree with that, Vik. Yeah.
But both are probably needed.
And I didn't mean to say NIH controlling the whole, controlling the process, because it was a public-private partnership. NIH for shorthand, but it was, the active trials was a public-private partnership. It was done by the Foundation for the NIH. But imagine a model where we do leverage and prioritize what's happening. In the UK, they did. They prioritized what was going to be tested. They went sequentially. They went steroids, and we didn't do that here. We were having so many trials that, and sadly, I forget the number now, but many trials that were completely uninformative and had no prospect of giving any information. And patients are the most valuable asset for in a trial, right? And we have to treat them with tremendous respect, because they're giving us information that is generalizable to future patients to come in a crisis.
No, totally agree. This is what Rob Califf always referred to as SCTs, small, I won't say what the C stands for, trials. And it's amazing that we were not able to do something on a broader scale as they were in the UK.
Excellent, thank you. And any other questions, please put them into the chat as we go. One of the things that that I wanted to pull a thread on with you both is investing in diverse things as well, right? Not putting all of our eggs in single baskets, and supporting American innovation across different companies, different sizes of companies, different areas of innovation. Not always knowing, obviously, exactly what's going to come up, but making sure the investments are spread out and diversified in ways that maximize the innovation happening in the country. And for our biodefense conversations and conversations through our Alliance to End Biological Threats that we run at CSR, we've had a lot of conversations that, in particular, smaller and newer companies are really still disadvantaged in a lot of ways. And even where we have leaders in government who are trying to get some of those tools and bids by such companies, they just can't always compete a lot of the time with some of the big behemoths. So even just being able to diversify the size and how old and established your company is in terms of government funding, and again, in which there are potentially billions of dollars already queued up. We recommend even more from CSR's perspective, but significant funding that's going to be going out the door from the federal government in the years ahead. Can you offer any thoughts on how you view this? How do you get the sort of diverse bioindustrial sort of complex that we need across the country? Why don't we start with Vik and then Lou? Or I'm sorry, let's reverse that. I think we're going to lose Lou at noon here. So Lou, do you want to offer a few thoughts and then we'll turn to Vik?
Sure, I do think that it's funding is, like you said, funding is going to be foundational. And I think that DARPA is a great model for funding, crazier projects that the only government will, take in those risks. But BARDA has also ventured into that world now and taken more risks. They set up BARDA Ventures. And I think that, more funding and more appetite for risk can remedy some of that. It's true that there's so much innovation that is left at the table, and it's kind of sad because it shouldn't be a matter of resources whether we are leveraging those, nurturing those potential innovations that are high risk, but it's all high risk at that stage. And of course, I think that the government should focus on the things that the private sector is now well suited to do, including things that have a very long horizon. It's harder for the private sector to take high risks for things that have a very long horizon. And in that regard, I think the mRNA vaccine is a great case study that it required. It wasn't big to begin with, but Moderna was a small company. And I think we should look at what worked there to be able to replicate that and understand that, out of one that succeeds, many, many more fail. I'll just say, also that it's incredible when you look back, quite extraordinary that we are the only, country that really was able to develop in a very quick amount of time, highly potent, effective vaccines, right? So we can't lose sight of that. And we have a responsibility to the world as well to find a way to be able to scale that up and not leave the rest of the world at the mercy of much weaker vaccines. So we have, and we did it in a good way. We understand the safety and efficacy profile, the risks. We continue to safety monitoring. I think we deserve credit for that, but how do we do that again and how to replicate that in the future?
It's an extraordinary story, Lou. And not everybody knows that over a decade ago, DARPA invested in Moderna and other companies, made a big bet on mRNA vaccines, and we're saving millions of lives as a result. It was that sort of daring, high-risk venture for not a lot of money. I think it was a $30 million a year program, if you can imagine. I have a question about nucleic acid products like mRNA vaccines and others, therapeutics. Manufacturing. I don't see a government program that's investing in innovation in manufacturing. DARPA has a small-scale effort, but can we have a global system to be able to surge and not have this sort of haves and have-nots in terms of vaccine production capacity? Are we on the verge of a disruptive technology for production of nucleic acid countermeasures that will be global?
Well, Arch launched, before, because I'll just say that, Arch launched a major company called Resilience, right? Which the sole purpose really is to focus that. It's been an area that has been neglected. How do we do this with the same passion and state-of-the-art technology that we put into the development of the product itself? How do we manufacture things, better, higher quality, faster? So I'm really excited about Resilience.
And actually, I was going to ask Lou to talk about Resilience because I think it's a phenomenal company, much needed, and is exactly focused in this area. Maybe, Andy, if I could comment on the previous question a little bit. I agree with what Lou said about risk, diversification. I do think there's two additional elements. One is that if you compare what we do in biotech to what happens in the defense procurement sector for other technologies, it's very different because the government is not the major customer. So, I had at one point collaborators who were working on shrinking atomic clocks and magnetometers to chip scale. That was useful for a variety of physics experiments, but they always knew that this was the kind of thing that would find its way into navigation systems and other systems of use to the Defense Department. That is not the case right now for technologies in this sector. There is no durable business model in between pandemic years that's well exercised, well understood, well established, where the government purchasing power can be deployed and risk capital doesn't just consider the first steps of technology, it flows to things that have sustainable business models. So that's one element of diversification that I think is, really missing. The second that I worry about a lot is we are talking about something that is fundamentally international in nature. Lou mentioned, for example, the great work in the UK. There are numerous other examples of that. And I think a lot of our success depends on international collaboration, figuring out how to do that in an environment of strained relations, and further barriers to capital flow to certain countries like China is also an element that thwarts diversification that I worry about.
Excellent. With that, we will also, I'll transition to the next question, which ties very nicely to that. I'll just read directly the question in the Q&A from before. So the public-private partnership model that we're talking about with government funding to largely private sector, also academic performers, is it sustainable in the political climate that we have today? When any big winners generate public demand to essentially nationalize the profits that are generated. The person says that the Bayh-Dole Act, which recognized that performers have no incentive to make additional investments required to commercialize innovation unless they can capture patent rights, has always been controversial and is becoming more so. Any thoughts on this question?
I'll pass Christine on this one. I think it's complicated. It was also posed in a very complex way, but we need to protect the private sector's ability to innovate and reap rewards from that innovation. If that's the question, whatever it takes, we can't lose sight that the innovation is happening in the private sector. And if you do things that will disadvantage that process, we're going to hurt ourselves in the long run.
And I think, there are things that we would trade as an industry, as is done in the defense industry, for this path that is a sustainable path for products to reach the market through government funding, in years between pandemics when the world's attention is not on these issues. So I think there's a natural way to resolve that. I don't feel that I can't think of examples where this has, or specifically government control over patents has really thwarted an industry, because so much more is required than initial intellectual property to develop any kind of biomedical product. So I'm not sure exactly what the person asking the question is worried about, but I think this is unlikely to be a barrier unless things change greatly. And in terms of the political appetite, we don't see a political appetite to nationalize the aerospace or defense industries or other industries. There's, of course, criticism about the military-industrial complex for many decades that, is now coming to healthcare. But I think it would likely be treated similarly, if not more generously.
Thanks for that. Andy, what are you most optimistic about? We'll turn the question to you on the technology side.
Well, home diagnostics are a big one for me. Real-time surveillance and the information technologies that can separate signal from noise. It's, to me, the problem, it's all about time. So if we can compress the times, early detection of both normal pathogens and novel pathogens. I want my doctor to be able to say, or even better at home, if I have a cold or a cough, not that I have flu or don't have flu. I want to know what I have. There are 300 or so respiratory pathogens. We ought to be able to test for all of them and identify specifically what is ailing me so we can have a tailored treatment. And I think that's going to take a revolution among the clinicians to use these new tools that are available. And there's also the regulatory piece that has to come along with that. But then to be able to take this metagenomic sequencing information and feed it into rapid countermeasures, I mean, the mRNA vaccine is a great example of a programmable platform. It took 10 months this time to have the emergency use authorization, but we were beginning trials in humans after 30 days. So let's keep working to compress the times from early detection to rapid countermeasures. And then we need to exercise this system, stress test this system. Planning and exercising is something the Department of Defense excels in, but we can't just wait around between pandemics, God forbid, before a bio attack. We need to maintain this strong system, to showcase this strong system as part of our deterrence strategy. And that's, that's what I'm excited about is this overall objective. I actually applaud the administration for the Lander-Sullivan pandemic prevention plan. The content of that is outstanding. It's the kinds of things that CSR has been advocating for years, but will it be funded? I mean, $65 billion would be a good start. It's not enough. And even that, it's not certain it's going to be funded at that level. And that's over 7 to 10 years. So the government really needs to step up and invest. This is a public good. It's a public function. And then leverage capital, private capital, and technology and innovation that are happening at a revolutionary speed.
Agreed fully. And on that, in our final minutes, I would ask both of our guests as well to name a question I'd like to end on. What gives you the most hope for our ability to better address catastrophic biological risk? It's hard to talk about this, obviously, with the pandemic still raging and really harming a lot of people and communities. And we haven't fully arrested that. But we're at this amazing technological moment as well to hopefully do much better deploying these things in the future. So as we think about solutions, just a few things that you could share that give you the most hope for looking to do much, much better when new disease threats emerge in the future. Why don't we start with Lou and then Vik?
Yeah, so I won't give you like a very precise answer, Christine, but I'll say that in aggregate is biomedical innovation that is occurring in the U.S. It's a pleasure to work in a place like ours, where every day I take calls with companies, startup companies, and it's inspiring to see what's happening out there. What they're imagining and what they are creating and what they're proposing to create and change the future. It's just it's a wonderful place to be, because you just feel happy every day to see that the future, will be brighter based on these super creative, committed, and entrepreneurial, individuals that are creating these companies based on amazing science.
Thanks. Vik?
Yeah, I really agree with Lou. The two things that give me the most hope, they're on opposite ends of the scale. One is something that Lou mentioned, which is just the pace with which we've developed new vaccines and proven in rigorous trials how effective they are. That is just an amazing triumph of science, and not something that you would have expected. The other thing at the other level of the response, is in spite of how disorganized we've been, there are individuals who've had just tremendous impact. In California, most of the testing capacity in the early days was just investigator-initiated efforts to fill in the gaps in what you would think the government is providing. And even things like people organizing themselves to move sick patients from rural areas and skilled nursing facilities into hospitals for treatment, just civilians doing that on a volunteer basis. That is very inspiring and shows a tremendous amount of resilience. So if we can just connect that spirit of resilience to the spirit of technological innovation embodied in the vaccine development, I think we have all of the raw ingredients for a much more effective pandemic response in the future.
Excellent, thank you. And tying that thread and Lou's together as well, I would just add from our side, one of the things that gives us the most hope Similarly is the incredible people out there who are dedicated, especially young people who are brilliant and really dedicating their lives to these issues in their careers. It's fantastic. We have our first in-person ever meeting yesterday with our second class of biofellows. Vik's colleague Damien was one of the first class. And these people knock your socks off in terms of their intelligence and passion. And this is what they're going to spend their time doing in their careers. So that always gives me lots of hope, in addition to all the technologies and tools that we have, the innovation that's occurring in the country. We just have to work together continuously to make sure we generate the political will to tap it maximally. And as Lou said earlier, optimize what we have and what we can do as a nation. So we're going to keep working on that from the Council on Strategic Risks perspective, and look forward to collaborating with you all toward the same end. So thank you so much again for joining us here for today's conversation. Thank you to all of our guests who have joined as well to tune in. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Good to see all of you.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.